Right, thanks everyone. So I'm going to start just by briefly talking about why we're talking about finance in the context of climate change. And to some of you that might seem very intuitive and obvious, but it's not always been so. And for a long time, people campaigning on climate change focused on lots of other different issues regarding the way that, particularly the way that public policy relates to how we tackle environmental problems. And we weren't really looking that one step removed about who was profiting from these problems and who was funding the kind of industries that were driving them. That changed in the 2000s, and Scotland is one of the places which really kind of drove forward that change, where we started to be really concerned about the investments of the massive Royal Bank of Scotland, which is based here in Edinburgh. And we had a really kind of diverse coalitions of organisations coming together to call for change from the way that the Royal Bank of Scotland was investing its money. And at the time, it was one of the largest banks in Europe, certainly one of the largest banks in the whole world, in fact. And it was the largest funder of fossil fuel projects in the whole of Europe. So and RBS prided itself on being a market leader in financing fossil fuels. They even had a website called theoilandgasbank.com, which they promoted for some years. And in the early stages of the campaign, it was even an effort to get them to admit that climate change existed. And that's not really surprising given how much money they were making from driving the problem. So this was a real wake-up call when we realised that there was this institution right here on our doorstep in the UK, which was making happen so much damage that was going on around the world. And to give you some kind of specific examples of how that might happen, some of the project finance that RBS was involved with meant that they had a role in being a broker between different extractive industries and other kind of forms of finance. So RBS wouldn't just give you a loan, although they would do that, and they probably sort you out with a bank account and some other kind of more practical things that you might need. But they would also act as a kind of central lender and as a go-between between lots of other financiers. So they might go to other banks, to hedge funds, to pension funds, to other investors, and go and sell your project to all of these different places to kind of bring in as much money on behalf of your project so that you can then build your pipeline. And RBS's role in kind of really trying to gather finance together from different places was just as significant, if not more so, than its direct role in its lending and funding for oil and gas extraction. And that's worth kind of understanding, because the way in which finance works is very complex, but that is a problem for the things which are driving climate change, but it's also something to think about when we want to understand how we can better finance the green economy as well. And of course, all of these lenders, when they come together, have different agendas, different ways in which they want to make money, which different timescales. And some of those things can be more or less harmful to the things that we want to do. So that was RBS in 2007. The year after that, the bank was on the brink of collapse, and it became fairly obvious that it wasn't just the environment which RBS had been acting wholly irresponsible towards. It was also very close to bringing down the entire British economy. And there was, of course, a famous phone call between the director of the Royal Bank of Scotland and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, where he said that we were going to run out of money within days and be bankrupt if you didn't do something about it. And the Chancellor did do something about it. The Royal Bank of Scotland and other private banks were bailed out to the tune of £45 billion in 2008. I have always had to check my notes for that because it seems such an absurdly huge amount of money. But it turned out it was actually a drop in the ocean of the full impact of the banking crisis on the economy. And New Economics Foundation and others have estimated that the damage caused by the bailout of the banks, the withdrawal of capital from all parts of society, the refusal to lend to socially useful things, and the the austerity which the UK government responded with, that the impact of all of those things was probably more than £1 trillion, and other estimates have gone higher. So in terms of, we often talk about the damage that the fossil fuel industry is doing to our climate, and that's obviously severe and it's obviously greater. But there's a great deal of public awareness about the damage that the banking sector has done, and the banking sector has caused great harm to our society and the environment in a very short term, right here in the UK. I'm reminded when we talk about this that there's still a lot of latent public anger about this, and people really feel quite strongly that the bankers who caused this financial crisis very much got away with it. There was very few criminal prosecutions related to these matters, unlike in other countries. So in Iceland, they did actually take the bankers to court and send them to jail, but we didn't do that in the UK. In fact, often we gave them a very, very good pension, and they've lived happily ever after. People are very understandably angry about that, and they want to see change. And there's not really anywhere on a UK level where that's likely to come from anytime soon. But we'll come back to that, and I think it's an important part of context to reflect upon. So that was the banking crisis, and where we are today is that we're kind of still in crisis state, really. So as you can see from this slide, the Royal Bank of Scotland is still majority owned by the UK government. It's essentially a public body, even though the government doesn't take responsibility for it in that way. And in Scotland, as a result of centuries of consolidation of high street banks, over 70% of current accounts are held with the Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyds Group, which is who own the Bank of Scotland. So just two banks owning more than 2/3 of all of high street current accounts. And one of the mantras that we heard as a diagnosis of the 2008 financial crisis was that banks were too big to fail, i.e. the market could not function properly because each individual bank had too large a proportion of the market, such that if it was to fail, as RBS nearly did, then the government could not reasonably allow it to do so. And that meant that the banks were sort of structurally protected from risk-taking because they knew that they were too big to fail for the future of the economy. And clearly, with more than 2/3 of Scottish customers, just two banks, we're in an even worse situation in Scotland than the whole of the UK. So this is pretty dire. And the former governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, he issued a warning a couple of years ago that he saw no reason to think that there wasn't another financial crisis on the horizon. And the kinds of warnings that we've had about overinvestment in fossil fuels with respect to how society is meeting climate change targets and the potential for a carbon bubble, these kinds of things just play into all the other fragilities that still exist in the banking system that were really not addressed by either David Cameron's coalition government or Theresa May's Conservative government. And there's been very little appetite in government to really seriously change fundamentally the way the banking system works. The other pressure on that, and there's an awful lot of words on this, I appreciate. The other pressure, of course, is about how banks have withdrawn funding from the green economy, and there's been lots of contributing factors to this. But I think for a while we felt we were hearing from government that we didn't need to continue subsidising the renewables industry because it was now efficient enough that it could compete with fossil fuel sources on its own, and so it was fine to leave it to the free market. And basically we had a time lag there where we couldn't immediately say the government was wrong. We thought they were wrong, but we couldn't immediately prove it because it takes time for the stats to come through. But after these policies were changed, it's very, very clear that actually there's been a dramatic fall in the financing of renewable energy. A dramatic and worrying collapse is what the UK Parliament's committee on the subject said. And the STUC has also proven that there's a real time drop in the amount of jobs in the low carbon economy, let alone the quality of those jobs. And there's lots of policy things that have driven this. And if you can see the slide, you can see the list on there, that we've had a whole raft of policies, many of which were introduced in the 2000s by the last Labour government, that have been withdrawn. And at the same time, this has been exacerbated by the UK's departure from the European Union, which means that we're not getting lending from the European Investment Bank anymore. We've had privatisation of the UK Green Investment Bank. And we've also got a situation where there are no major public bodies in the UK that are set up to build or run renewables infrastructure. And there are plenty in other countries. And that's why we've got this extraordinary statistic in that 51% of offshore wind in the UK is owned by public companies, but not UK ones. They're owned by Danish and German and Chinese and so on public companies. And because other countries do have public bodies that build infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure, in order that the public benefits from those things, and they're profiting very happily from it. And they're doing that in the UK because we don't have any kind of public bank or public renewable energy companies do that in the UK. And so we're in a pretty bad state regarding investment in the transition, and we're in a pretty bad state with the sense of the state of the financial sector. Just to give you some bit more picture about why the private banking sector is particularly the concern here. This is a graph which shows the proportion of banks' investments which are in the real economy. And what we mean by that is banks owning and investing in infrastructure and sort of tangible things in the economy. That is as opposed to investing in speculation or currency or other kind of invented financial products. And all of these are below half, which should be remarkable in itself. But at the bottom, you can see is all of these UK banks. So these are some of the largest banks in Europe, and the UK banks are all in the bottom half because they're overwhelmingly disinterested in investing in real things. And that's because building up a small company from scratch and helping them finance the growth of their company, be it food retail or manufacturing cars or whatever, actually is not as profitable as simply gambling on the price of currency going up and down, or buying and selling existing infrastructure which someone else has already bothered to build. So banks like Lloyds Group at the bottom there, which is what have we got there? That's 2010. There's probably about 5% investment in the real economy. Almost all of what it's investing in and for growth is just gambling on things that already exist and kind of invented financial products. So, but overwhelmingly, these banks are not really doing anything useful. But the other thing that this graph shows is that the red banks, which are the commercial banks owned by shareholders, are the worst for this. So they're mostly in the bottom half. And then in the top half, we have stakeholder banks. And what we mean by that is banks which are owned by either public bodies or cooperatives. And they have a much better track record of investing in more useful things in the real economy, which don't just inflate the price of commodities and so on. So having considered that stakeholder banks, public banks, are generally more useful, how does the UK economy compare with its amount of public banking that we have? Well, you can see by this slide pretty badly. Germany has one of the largest state-owned banks in the world, and the KfW, which actually makes its balance sheet is 18% of German GDP, so that's pretty huge. The Green Investment Bank, which was public when this graph was made, that's not anymore, and the British Business Bank, which is a very small UK government-owned bank, so much less than 1%. I mean, that's 0.0 something. It's a really, really tiny proportion of the economy. And that means they're nowhere near big enough to actually influence the direction of economic development, like the German State Investment Bank is. And as you can see, Brazil and Japan also on that graph, and other state investment banks generally are big enough to have a role in actually shaping the future development of the economy. This is kind of just similar representation of the same thing. You've got the United Kingdom down at the bottom there, with Canada in terms of the proportion of the proportion of the banking sector which is just shareholder-owned commercial banks, and there we have Germany at the top. That big turquoise-coloured bar is the German state bank again, and then the regional banks in Germany, and also they have local banks, and I'll get on to that in a minute. So there's a picture of the Scottish banking sector. As we mentioned, the Royal Bank of Scotland and the Lloyds Group, the Bank of Scotland, holding a vast majority of current accounts in Scotland. And you can see there's some tiny little dots on the bottom right-hand side. This graph is a couple of years old. When it was made, there was a bank called the Airdrie Savings Bank, which was a locally owned trustee savings bank based in Airdrie, as you might expect. It was several hundred years old, and a very simple structure that meant that it was required to be very safe and not permitted to be investing in risky assets or commodities or anything like that. But the bank said it was going to need to close its doors a couple of years ago, and as a result, we have no cooperative or more publicly owned banks in a meaningful sense in Scotland at all, for the first time in several hundred years. So given this state of affairs in the banking sector, Friends of the Earth Scotland produced a proposal for reform of the banking sector in 2016, and we called it Banking for the Common Good. We produced this with Commonweal and the New Economics Foundation, and we presented this to the political parties and so on. And this chart summarizes the proposals, and it's obviously, there's a lot going on here, so I'm just going to talk you through. At the bottom of this is the National Investment Bank. So we felt that there was a strong need for a new institution which could invest at scale in national level public infrastructure, and to also really shape the future of the economy in Scotland. And that's the National Investment Bank, and that would fulfill this role that we have in other countries where we have a state investment bank which is large enough that it's actually able to really change the future of the industrial policy in that country. And it does that by lending on preferential terms to things which are more socially useful. So that's the National Investment Bank, and that kind of underpins a lot of what's going on here. In the middle, these darker blobs, we have some regional investment banks, and they're important because the National Investment Bank, being a large national institution, is going to be well equipped to invest in big projects, like, for example, a huge offshore wind farm. But it's not going to be well suited to invest in small businesses, social enterprises, local recycling projects and things like that. And so we need regional banks to do that, and we proposed to have a number of these which should be linked with local authorities. And then there's also potential beneath that to have much more kind of neighbourhood scale local banking institutions, like credit unions, for example. So this is a whole new constellation, if you like, of public institutions in Scotland, which would reinvent the banking sector and reorientate it from trying to extract money from the economy in the short term, which is primarily what private banks do. So an end to this kind of very short-termist approach banking, and moving towards a very service-driven, public good-orientated banking system, which works at different scales. And if you want to know more about this, you can look at the Friends of the Earth Scotland for Banking for the Common Good. You can find it on the Commonweal website as well. Now, encouragingly, so we produced this paper in 2016, and we took it to the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament, and in 2017, Nicola Sturgeon announced that the Scottish Government wanted to introduce a bill to create a national investment bank, and that was our institution on the right-hand side there in the mauve colour. So that was really encouraging, and from an early stage, Nicola Sturgeon has been fairly clear that a major focus of this bank would be to invest in low carbon jobs and the just transition to a green economy. And she's mentioned that on a number of occasions, most recently in her address to the Scottish Trades Union Congress, where she talked about the National Investment Bank's role as being a way in which Scotland would deliver on a Green New Deal. I'll come back to that a bit later to see if sort of Nicola Sturgeon's words match the actions of what we've seen. So that was the picture of what we wanted, and we had this proposal for the National Investment Bank. This is the bill. This is the law that is to be introduced to the Scottish Parliament, and this is the very top of that bill, explaining what the bill says the purpose of the National Investment Bank would be. Now, I've never trawled through legislation before, so I'm not an expert on unpicking all the kind of different legalese that you find in these things. But as pieces of legislation go, the National Investment Bank bill is fairly simple, because mostly what it does is it says we're going to create a company. This company is going to be owned by the Scottish Government, and the company, like every company, will have articles of association. So if you create a company, if you wanted to start a company selling beans, then you would have to create articles of association and to have those registered formally. And any company has to do that, even one owned by the Scottish Government. And the bill mostly says this bank will exist in law, and that means that the law will have to be changed to privatise it, and that the articles of association of this new company, the National Investment Bank, will have to include the following things. And so anything that is bunged in the bill under those auspices then has to be transposed to the articles of association of the bank. And the key stuff really at the end of the day is this top line about what the point of this bank is. And it says, and perhaps you can read it yourself as well, that it's about promoting or sustaining economic development or employment in Scotland, which I would argue is a fairly benign sentence. And then it has these 5 ancillary objects. And I'm going to read those out because some of them need can use a little bit of kind of explanation. So the first is investing in inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Now, inclusive growth is a term that the Scottish Government has used a lot over the last 2 years, especially, and they see this as a marrying of an agenda to promote ending inequality with the Scottish Government's enthusiasm for growing the economy in a traditional kind of neoliberal way, if you like. And inclusive growth is about saying that we want to grow, we want the economy to be larger and more productive, but we want that as it does that, it shares that growth with more people and makes the country less unequal. Now, there's lots of criticisms of that approach, but that's what they mean when they say inclusive. Sustainable economic growth is an interesting one because plenty of people that you'll speak to in government and in politics will describe that in a way that suggests that when they say sustainable, they just mean economic growth that exists in perpetuity. So if economic growth is to be sustained, that just means that it continues on and on and on and on, which doesn't have anything to do with the environment. But some people in government will tell you that sustainable economic growth, a little bit like the inclusive thing, is saying that the economy will get larger and larger, and that's an objective, but that in doing so, it will reduce its impact on the environment. And this is kind of associated with this concept of decoupling, and the idea that, you know, can we have more and more economic activity whilst reducing the total impact on the environment? And then there's lots of reasonable questions about that, but there's a considerable amount of ambiguity about that phrase, sustainable economic growth, and for that reason we think it's really unhelpful that they put that in the bill. And so that's the first one. The next one, about promoting the activities of enterprises. The key phrase here is where lack of investment is holding back economically viable commercial activity. And so this is essentially regarding, this is a reference to the financial crisis. So since the financial crisis, there has been a significant reduction in the amount of money that's been lent to small and medium-sized businesses. And this is traditionally something which commercial banks did a lot of lending. But it turns out that it's quite expensive to lend to small and medium-sized businesses. You have to do a reasonable amount of due diligence. You have to go to the effort of having serious conversations with businesses when they come to you, and you have to do a considerable amount of research to work out if they're viable and if it's profitable for you to give them a loan. And banks like RBS have basically decided they can't really be bothered with doing that anymore, and they've withdrawn from small and medium-sized businesses. So this second purpose means that the SNIB would have a permanent role to fill that gap. And I would argue that is kind of letting commercial banks off the hook for their failures, if you like. But that's what that second one is about. The third one is developing small and medium-sized enterprises in general, which again follows from the same sort of thing. And there's a general kind of tone we get from government that they like to talk about small and medium-sized businesses, I think largely because, you know, big business doesn't sound very sexy politically, whereas small and medium-size sounds fine. It is worth bearing in mind that the definition of SMEs goes up into the hundreds of employees. So for those of you who have an idea of a small business as being sort of one person and their dog, that's not what we're talking about. Actually, generally talking about multiple hundreds of people. The fifth one there, creating and shaping markets through the provision of patient capital. That's really good, and that what that means is a bank which is very ambitious in the sorts of things it wants to do in terms of changing the way the economy is functioning and the sorts of benefits that are flowing from the economy. So that is exactly the kind of thing that we need if we are to have a bank which is lending in a way that shifts the economy away from fossil fuels in a fairly rapid way. For example, creating and shaping markets could mean that the SNIB creates a domestic supply chain to create wind turbines. We don't have that at the moment in Scotland. We import the wind turbines that we're erecting in the sea. The SNIB, by having this ancillary objective, is freed, if you like, to be able to actually spend time and effort creating a whole supply chain where one that currently doesn't exist. And that's a pretty difficult and expensive thing for a public bank to do. So it's really good that it's in there, and we need to make sure actually that it's emphasized, perhaps compared with some of these other things. Particularly this final one, which is fairly benign and generic, which is just around achieving economic policy objectives, which are broadly dealt with in the rest of the objects. So that's a kind of assessment of what's in there, but there's problems with what's not in there. The most top level glaring thing for us at Friends of the Earth is that the bill doesn't mention anything about the environment and climate change. So just regarding that phrase, sustainable economic growth, the government, some people in the government think that means they've dealt with climate change and environmental issues. We don't think that they have done so. They need to have a much less ambiguous approach to that in the bill. And so we want to get the bill changed so that it's much more explicit about that it will fund a transition to a zero carbon economy. And the term decarbonisation is one that the government seems to quite like at the moment, but there's some sort of negotiation there about the usefulness of different terms. But the point that it just doesn't really mention the environment is fairly obvious and clear, especially when compared with Nicola Sturgeon's rhetoric on the subject. And I've mentioned on the slide there about sustainable economic growth. And just in general, as an organisation, we're very supportive of the work which has been going on to emphasise and prioritise other measures of economic progress, like well-being, like the protection of human rights, environmental quality, and even things like carbon emissions. And that we need those to be emphasised in these objectives, rather than filling gaps in the economy where private banks are failing, which is actually a fairly kind of defensive approach to what this bank would do. We would like to see it being much bolder. And there's plenty of precedents in Scottish public policy to do that. The Scottish Government has something called the National Performance Framework, which is sort of copies and pastes to some extent something called the UN goals, used to be called the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a whole range of public purpose kind of missions that we want governments to be focusing on, like reducing inequality and poverty, tackling low environmental standards, improving health, reducing infant mortality, all these kinds of things. And the government has objectives to deal with all of these different UN goals through their national performance framework. So we can have the National Investment Bank looking towards those purposes as well. But the bill doesn't currently provide for that. Most obviously, it fails to provide for that by its focus on economic policy rather than other policy areas. And there's no reason, for example, why a National Investment Bank couldn't be financing business with a view to improving people's health, for example. And there's plenty of ways in which economic development could be improving people's health in Scotland, and that would be quite a reasonable focus. So just to kind of summarise then about what we think the point of the National Investment Bank is, and we want to see it lending for the public good. And we've currently got a banking sector which is overwhelmingly focused on short-term private profit, and we need public institutions that do this differently. And that could also affect things like who they employ. Because we have such a big private banking sector in Edinburgh, there's a risk to some extent that this institution gets captured by lots of jaded, retired ex-RBS people who get snapped up by the National Investment Bank, and then we kind of end up copying their toxic culture. And to some extent, I think that's why the issue of pay has become important. And if you Google the National Investment Bank, you'll find lots of press stories about how much people who work in this bank might get paid, because the development group in the government at the moment are of the opinion that they shouldn't follow normal public pay policy, and they should be allowed to pay people much more than other public servants. And I think that is a pathway to following this same kind of toxic culture that we have in the private banking sector. So we think it should be lending to the public good. We think it needs to be delivering a just transition to a zero carbon economy. And we also think it needs to have really good ethical standards, governance and transparency. And there are some details of what's already been proposed with respect to that, which are either lacking in detail or actively unimpressive. Let's put it that way. And I'm going to finish on some of that detail, and then we'll go to a bit of questions. So, for ethical lending, we've been told, although we're yet to see anything, that proposals for the National Investment Bank's lending policies will be published in some sort of draft form over the summer, but we've not seen anything to date about how this might function. Friends of Scotland has assessed what other public bodies and private banks have been doing on their ethical lending processes, and even looking towards RBS, in fact, who we've been campaigning on for some years and therefore have adopted some useful processes. And there are two things that we think we need to see in a good ethical lending program. One is that we have a baseline minimum standard, and if companies don't meet that minimum standard, then they're just excluded. They're not welcome to borrow from the National Investment Bank. And that should flow from things like the National Performance Framework and the wider public purposes of the Scottish Government. So we want companies to be adhering to basic environmental, human rights and transparency standards. And examples of that, so a very clear example of that at Friends of the Earth Scotland would be not lending to fossil fuel companies. Given that the bank is supposed to be about long-term investment, and the government is clear that we need a zero carbon economy within the next 30 years, it would be bonkers for them to be lending to any fossil fuel companies. But we need a process in order to make sure that that's clear and transparent, and that companies know that as well. And that also goes for other bits of basic standards, like, for example, paying the minimum wage. And again, there's been some interesting discussions about that if you want to look up on Google, with some people arguing actually that the SNIB shouldn't exclude businesses that don't pay the minimum wage, because that would exclude a number of rural businesses and things like that. And yeah, I personally think that that's a bit of a cop-out, but there's some interesting kind of discussions around that. So that's a minimum standards assessment. And then once that's done, once you have your investment universe, if you like to use a techie term, you've got all of the different kinds of companies that you are willing to lend to that go above the minimum standard. You've hopefully got more businesses wanting to borrow from the bank than you have money. There's some element of competition, and if that exists, then that means you need to work out who you're going to lend to. The bank has already been clear that it will consider, it will need to have some sort of commerciality to it, if you like, and that's consistent with the fact that the bank is intended to be set up in order to make some kind of return that it can then invest in other companies in the future. So it does need to charge some kind of interest rate, but it doesn't need to do that in as kind of harsh or short-termist way as other banks do. And it can weigh that against the extent to which projects meet the missions and aims of the bank. And those, we can have a kind of scorecarding system to do that. And at the moment, the government is intending to issue 3 missions to this bank, and one of those is around tackling climate change. But that's likely to be, those missions could be changed in the future. So that would be our ethical lending proposal. Regarding tackling inequality as well, we think there's some other kind of practical things that they need to do, and most especially we're concerned that they haven't thought about how a bank that tackles inequality and achieves inclusive development would work, because there's not one that exists in Scotland. So they've got some heavy lifting to do if they're going to work that out. I think we'd like to see a serious assessment of the existing finance roles that the Scottish Government has and how they're benefiting different groups of people, for example, based on deprivation, on gender, and so on. And secondly, we'd like to see lending which goes to marginalised groups in society. And if inclusive growth means anything, then it should mean including people that are currently excluded. So that means disabled people, people of colour, people from deprived communities, and they need to do some proactive work to work out how that happens. They need some internal processes to make sure that there's very kind of best practice on diversity within the bank's own functions. And we want to see a gender diverse board and representation on the board of the bank as well. And that last one should be enforced by existing rules around public bodies in Scotland, but the board is yet to be appointed, and we will kind of wait and see how that comes out. I'll skip to that next slide in just a moment. So these are the kind of various things that we would like to kind of be pushing for in this bank. Just going back to what we think the point of the whole thing is before I move on to some sort of tactical concerns. This broader picture of what we think the National Investment Bank's role is needs to sit within those wider proposals about how we reform the banking sector in general. So this is a national scale institution. It's a big kind of centralized body that we're creating here. It's not likely to be able to do all of those things that we need, like lending at a local level and understanding the challenges of small social enterprises and so on. So we think there needs to be a decentralised element to banking reform in Scotland as well. And there's been a lot of pushback on that. And the Scottish Government saying, we're too busy creating this new SNIB thing. And we need to do that first before we deal with some of the localised issues, how we think about branch banking and so on. So the role is diminished and focused with respect to that. The other thing is about what kinds of projects that the National Investment Bank lends to. And the Scottish Government has gone a bit back and forth on this, but they've increasingly emphasised that it will be primarily for lending to private bodies. Now, that doesn't necessarily exclude local government and things like universities, but in practice, it probably will. And that means that this bank is mainly going to be lending to the private sector, and that there's a big hole basically in where the lending will come from to public bodies like local authorities. And we do really have a crisis in that kind of lending at the moment, because the public-private partnerships which built all of the hospitals and schools, some of which are falling to bits over the last 10 years, that kind of lending is not available to local councils anymore because they're so heavily indebted. And we do need a new way to lend to public bodies. And it's clearly a fairly immediate necessity to solve that problem with respect to climate change, because we need a lot of public investment. We need investment that's going to be publicly owned and controlled in order to build new infrastructure, like, for example, zero carbon transport at a local level, or offshore wind. We want a greater proportion of the new economy to be in public hands. And the National Investment Bank is primarily focused on lending to the private sector, and it's not currently going to solve that problem. So that's just putting this SNIB in context. But having said that, there is a lot of potential here, and the National Investment Bank could be addressing a number of our concerns. It's a fairly far-reaching project, but on the scale of which the Scottish Government tends to be rolling out policy. And there is an opportunity to get it clearly enshrined in law that this bank would not be investing in fossil fuel companies and would be focused on the just transition. And we don't have any public bodies of scale, with this kind of scale in the UK that are able to do that at present. And so that would be a boost to the just transition movement, to the divestment movement, and so on. There we go. So there's the National Investment Bank. So Friends of the Earth Scotland has launched a campaign. We launched this publicly on Monday, called Divest Scotland. And this campaign is asking for support from MSPs that the government and Parliament divests from fossil fuels and invests in a just transition to a zero carbon economy. And we've asked MSPs to pledge their support for that specific objective. And we've had 15 MSPs do that already. You can see some of the pictures of them there, mostly Greens and Labour, but we've also had one Liberal Democrat and a former SNP minister, a guy called Marco Biaggi, and he's third from the left on the top row. So that's really wonderful that we've got support from MSPs to take that forward. The pledge and the campaign is very broadly drawn with the intention that we can use support from MSPs to apply pressure on changing the way that MSPs' pensions are invested, to apply pressure on how the National Investment Bank bill comes through Parliament, and also what the National Investment Bank actually does in practice, but also to give us something to work on in the future regarding other ways in which the government finances and invests, for example, for its infrastructure spending and city deals and ways it works and funds local authorities and so on. So there's lots of ways in which government investment could and should do more to get out of fossil fuels and back a just transition. And the Divest Scotland campaign and the associated pledge from MSPs is about garnering support from that. So we've just launched that, and if you search for MSPs fossil fuels or something like that, you'll see lots of news articles that we had on Monday getting the support. But if the opportunity is there to use the tools on the Friends of the Earth Scotland divestment website to talk to your MSP, send them an email, and to get them to pledge their support for this, but also just to use it as a way to start a conversation with them about the National Investment Bank. And the bill timetable has now been published by the Scottish Government, and it's currently being scrutinised by the Economy Committee. They've been having hearings on Tuesday mornings from various speakers about ways in which the bank could and should work and what the bill currently does. And the MSPs will be voting on the bill in stage 1 before the end of September. So that will be the key time, and there'll be an opportunity at the end of September for either the government or individual MSPs and parties to propose amendments to that bill. And we want to use that time to build support for changes which both add in a clear purpose on funding a just transition and getting out of fossil fuels, and secondly, to make clear that the bank will have strong and sort of market-leading ethical investment processes. So those are two things that we think really need to be in the bill, and we need amendments to get that. At the moment, we're in discussion at an organisational level with civil servants to see if the government could be encouraged to make some of those corrections themselves. But if that doesn't happen, or even if it does, MSPs will have a really key role in forging through those improvements to the bill. That's obviously their job, is to scrutinise and improve legislation. And we are very hopeful that we can use these conversations we're having around divestment with MSPs to get their support in their parties and as individuals for amending this bill to make the bank really clear about its support for a more environmental and socially beneficial approach to banking. So if that's something you'd be interested in helping out with, then please drop me an email, and I'd love to work with you about it, or give you some advice and support if you're interested in raising it locally. And we can also do, we've also got some capacity to organise and support people doing things like public meetings at a local level, if that sounds like something you're interested in. So I'm going to close that presentation now, and I'll just give you the opportunity to ask any final questions or make any final contributions before we close. That's great. Well, thanks to all of you. Please do make a note of my email address. It's rlander@foe.scot. And if you want any resources, you've got any questions, or you might like to help with our campaign to get the National Investment Bank to be greener, and then we would love to hear from you. So just drop me a line. Thanks very much, everyone. I'm closing the call now.